Welcome. In our previous video, we examined America's entry into World War I and the secret decisions made there. Now, as the US is once again being questioned and the world is being dragged into the fire, what lies behind the silence before Pearl Harbor? Before moving on to the video, you can subscribe to the channel and support the things you like in the video. Silence and observation. In 1939, America silently watched as Europe descended into renewed turmoil. News from the streets of Berlin reported the rapid growth of armies and the deployment of tanks along the border. Military exercises intensified in Mussolini's Italy, and new bases were being established in African colonies. In the Pacific, Japan was attacking various regions of China, capturing villages and cities. These reports echoed in the headlines of American newspapers. Radio broadcasts reached the public, spreading anxiety. Debates continued in Congress in Washington. Isolationists argued that the US should not interfere in European and Asian affairs, while interventionists demanded preparations against the growing threat. The majority of the public, however, said, "Let's not get involved. Let the war stay far away from us." The streets seemed calm, but every corner carried an unconsciously escalating tension. As people returned to their jobs and homes, they repeated the anxious sentences from the news in their minds. But the situation was very different in the decision-making rooms of Washington. The president and his advisors, officers, and diplomats meticulously monitored every move, weighing every report, every map, every intelligence note with great care. Maps were opened, arrows drawn, potential lines of attack and defensive zones determined, weapons stockpiles were checked, and the deployment points of naval forces were recalculated. Every small change could be a harbinger of a potential disaster. No one spoke loudly, for words could sometimes be the beginning of a plan, sometimes the beginning of a catastrophe. Silence had become the most tense element in these rooms. Hours passed without a word, avoiding eye contact, trying to decipher the meaning of every small movement. Looking out the windows, the sky seemed calm, but that calm was only the silence of an approaching storm. An advisor picked up a pen, paused for a moment on the map, then slowly pointed in another direction. An officer nodded. No one explained its meaning. Everyone knew what was happening, but they didn't want to talk about it. And this is precisely what the viewer should feel. America seemed to stand detached from the world, but every glance, every note, and every silence was a harbinger of impending disaster. The silence was not just waiting, but also a sign of indecision, fear, and a decision that would shape the future. No one knew when the next move would come, which country would push the boundaries, which fleet would launch the first attack. But the viewers felt this. This silence would not last long. The storm could break at any moment. The price of neutrality. America was neutral. This neutrality created a sense of security in the daily lives of the people, allowing things to continue as normal on the streets. But the situation was entirely different in the decision-making rooms. In the rooms of the White House and the halls of Congress in Washington, every glance was an assessment, every breath a message of caution. The president and his advisors were reviewing intelligence reports from Europe and Asia, one after another, weighing the possible consequences of each detail. Every line, number, map, and report contained clues to a future step. Isolationists spoke loudly in Congress, arguing that the American people should not get involved in the war. Interventionists, on the contrary, argued that the cost of delayed decisions would be heavier in the future and that military preparation and alliances should not be ignored. The debates intensified, words sometimes taking on a threatening tone, sometimes creating silent pressure. The president tried to strike a balance amidst all these voices, on the one hand, maintaining public trust, on the other hand, preventing international crises, and most importantly, minimizing the cost of a potential future war. Naval modernization had accelerated. Ships were being prepared for maintenance and armament in ports, and officers and technicians were checking every detail repeatedly. Heavy machinery, cannons, and ammunition crates were both an indication of preparation for a possible war and a silent message being followed in Washington. America had to be ready, but it hadn't yet made its decision. While the public went about their business in the streets, simulations conducted in secret meetings confronted America with a completely different reality. In Europe, Germany had invaded Poland, and Britain and France were on high alert. Japan was making rapid strides in the Pacific and accelerating its advance into China. Every move was being examined by the president and his advisors, and new arrows, strategic points, and possible scenarios were being marked on maps. This silence created a sense of security for those watching, giving the feeling that we will not go to war. But in the decision-making rooms, a crisis was ready to erupt at any moment. Every report, every move, was a harbinger of a storm. The silence wasn't just waiting, it was the first silent sign of an approaching storm. And all these calculations were laying the groundwork for the steps America would take in the years to come. The moment of decision approaches. In the White House chambers, tension intensified as the hours passed. The president's eyes were on the map. Which lines were being defended in Europe? Which ports were potentially under threat? Everything was being noted down. Advisors silently took notes, repeatedly checking the reports they had. Any mistake could change the fate not only of the United States, but also of the world order. Radio news informed the public outside, but the reality was far more complex. In Berlin, Hitler's armies were conducting new exercises. Mussolini's troops had accelerated their preparations in North Africa. Japan had not stopped its advance in China and had seized new ports. Each move was not just news for America, it was part of a possible war scenario. Debates in Congress were becoming fierce. Isolationists argued that war would only lead to casualties and that the public was not ready for it. Interventionists, on the other hand, explained the cost of the decision that was delayed every day, foreshadowing even greater losses that would be inevitable in the future. The president was trying to strike a balance amidst all these voices. Every glance, every gesture, every pause was like a silent message to those watching. The arrows drawn on the maps, the points marked, were no longer just symbols. They were indicators of possible attack and defense lines. The deployment of the naval fleet, the safety of the ports, and the allocation of troops to which fronts were being silently considered. Everyone knew time was no longer measured by waiting, but by decision-making. The silence in those rooms had become so profound that even the touch of a pen on paper, the gentle rustling of a page, and the light falling on the windowsill conveyed the shadow of war. And all these silent movements spoke of an approaching catastrophe. The beginning of the silent storm. As the days passed, the silence that America had been observing had become a source of tension. From the outside, the public seemed to be going about their daily lives, the streets crowded, the cities vibrant. But the situation in the rooms of Washington was very different. Maps were being reopened, arrows drawn, and every possible scenario weighed repeatedly. The president's advisors spoke quietly, each suggestion reconsidered and then withdrawn. Each word seemed to remind a small mistake could change the entire balance. The naval fleet was being deployed in the ports, and army units were planning their movements. War had not yet reached America, but the plans, preparations, and intelligence work were silently growing like a harbinger of a storm. Movements in Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo were being carefully monitored in Washington. New planes, tanks, ships, each was part of a scenario. The president and his advisors were analyzing possible attacks, defensive points, and the attitudes of the Allies, weighing every step. Every calculation formed the basis of a future decision. The silence in those rooms carried a strange weight. The touch of pens on paper, the rustling of maps, the sounds the wind carried through the window, all were silent messages of an approaching storm. No one spoke loudly, for every word spoken could be the beginning of a plan or a catastrophe. And the viewer should feel this. America seemed to be standing outside the war, but every calculation, every note, and every silence was a silent harbinger of the second great catastrophe to come. The world was being divided again, and America would no longer be merely an observer. Silent observation and rising tension. By late 1939, America was silently but carefully watching the rising dangers in Europe. Military parades in the streets of Berlin had become more frequent and regular. The sounds of gunfire and footsteps echoed in the ears of the people walking through the city, and every street corner seemed like a silent harbinger of a threat. In Mussolini's Italy, the displayed power was perceived as a glaring threat in the public eye. Military parades, displays of new weapons, and propaganda posters were the clearest indication that the balance of power in Europe was shifting. Japan's advance into China seemed like a conflict on a distant continent, but in the rooms of Washington, everyone was calculating its global consequences. What was written in the newspapers reached the public's ears. Cities and towns read the news, but most citizens said, "Let's not get involved." Staying out of the war seemed like a safe choice. Life flowed on in the streets, schools, factories, and stock markets seemed to be going about their normal days. But the situation in the White House was quite different. Silence reigned in the rooms, but this silence, like the deep stillness before a storm, created a tension within everyone. Maps were spread out on the tables, arrows were drawn, every movement and position carefully marked. Officers and advisors spent hours at the maps, recalculating the arrows, the markers, the estimated enemy movements, weighing which scenario would lead to which disaster. Every note, every marker was like a silent harbinger of an approaching storm. But no one made a decision aloud, for words had power. Speaking them carried a meaning akin to summoning the truth. Meanwhile, debates continued in Congress. The verbal duels between isolationists and interventionists weighed heavily on the whole, each speech subtly hinting at the next step. The price of neutrality. America continued to remain neutral, but decision-making was becoming increasingly difficult. A country caught between economic interests, public opinion, international pressure, and military capacity, congressional debates were no longer just about opinions, but about strategies that would determine the future. while isolationists said, "Let's mind our own business." Interventionists loudly voiced the dangers in Europe and the Pacific. The president accelerated fleet modernization, calculating the technical capabilities and operational range of each warship. Military planners simulated possible scenarios on the European and Pacific fronts, putting every mistake and potential loss on the table. For the public, this silence seemed reassuring, but in the decision-making rooms, there was a potential for crisis every minute. The silence wasn't just waiting. It was a sign like the calm before the storm. Every report subtly hinted at a possible attack. Every map was marked, arrows drawn, and the moves of the Allies predicted. American officers recorded every small change. Every messenger communicated with the soldiers, and possible scenarios were reviewed again and again. These preparations were silent but imbued with deadly caution. For once the action was taken, there was no turning back. And now every report was no longer just a piece of information, but a silent harbinger of impending disaster. Every arrow drawn carried the shadow of the next step, while officers simultaneously performed complex calculations unseen by the public. Ports, factories, the fleet and the aircraft, all were preparations for the next move. A silent but deadly planning process. Reports breaking the silence. New reports arrived daily. Each report contained details of a potential war, and plans were being reshaped at American strategy desks. Movements in Europe were closely monitored. The maneuvers of armies in Germany were recorded. Displays of force in Mussolini's Italy were not ignored, and Japan's advance into China was compiled daily. The expressions on the faces of advancing American officials after the report were a silent but sharp warning. Danger was near, but the right move required an attack. But when should this village be built? Which signaling passes would suffice? Debates in Congress dragged on. The verbal battle between isolationists and interventionists intensified daily. Who was right? Who was wrong? And most importantly, could the Americans really make the right decisions? But a different kind of silence reigned in the presidential office. Not his, but his signal was seen as part of the impending war. Every meeting somehow envisioned the next step, its perspective and discourse bearing the shadow of the present catastrophe. The American people went about their daily lives. The streets were normal, but the numbers at the White House and headquarters had almost completely stopped. Every minute was spent trying to resolve a potential crisis. No one spoke, no one panicked, but their eyes were fixed on a report, on a map within it. The silence had become the culmination of tension. As officers reviewed a report, they whispered to each other, "Is this movement a real threat? How prepared are the Allies? If we decide to intervene, can we predict the consequences?" The answer to each question was uncertain. Each answer revealed a new possibility, and each possibility created new questions. Telephone lines were meticulously monitored. Every messenger soldier, every signal, and every intelligence note carefully recorded. And every piece of recorded information echoed through the headquarters walls like a silent alarm. The difference between the America the public saw in the streets and what was happening in the presidential office and headquarters was growing. Outside, the city was calm. Inside, an approaching storm was brewing. Every minute was a potential crisis. Every report a harbinger of imminent action. The silence was no longer just silence. It was a breathing tension, a silent warning of impending disaster. And everyone was asking, how much longer can this silence last? When will the first sparks of war ignite? Are we ready? The answer to each question was unknown, but the unknown amplified the tension and curiosity exponentially. The calm before the storm. As December 1939 approached, America was no longer merely a spectator. Preparations were underway internally. Fleet modernization accelerated, and the military's logistical and strategic plans were reviewed. Ships were rearranged in ports, weapon systems tested, and ammunition stocks and spare parts meticulously checked. Maps were repeatedly opened, arrows redrawn, and every report carefully examined. Every sign, every numerical data point indicated the pre-calculated steps of a potential war. The president and his advisors assessed every possibility, knowing that even the smallest mistake would be irreversible, and constantly updated their plans. Debates in Congress were still fierce. Isolationists argued, "Let's mind our own business," while interventionists loudly voiced the dangers in Europe and the Pacific. But now, the silences were more meaningful. This silence was not merely a period of waiting, but a growing warning. America's neutrality was being tested, and the world was silently dividing in two. Which step should be taken? Could the consequences be predicted once a decision was made? No one knew for sure, but everyone could hear the breath of the storm behind the silence. Every step, every plan carried the shadow of impending catastrophe. Every map marker indicated a potential point of war. Officers, diplomats, and intelligence officers meticulously examined every report, recorded every Allied movement, noting the slightest change. Newspapers showed normal life in the streets. People shopped. Children went to school. But in the White House and headquarters, time seemed to stand still. Every minute was spent trying to resolve a potential crisis. Every minute passed in a silence that shaped a potential catastrophe. Officers constantly asked, "When should this step be taken? What signal will be enough to trigger action? How ready are the Allies?" The questions multiplied, the answers grew uncertain, each uncertainty creating a new wave of tension. Every map, every note, every marker indicated the next steps of an approaching storm. Every glance and every word echoed like a silent alarm. And so, for America, the silence was no longer just silence. It was a breathing tension, a silent warning of impending disaster. Every report was like a hook, every meeting a clue. Every minute felt the breath of a future conflict, the shadow of the approaching storm lengthening. American officers and decision-makers noted every small detail, weighed every possibility, and each night quietly asked, "How much longer will this silence last? Will we be ready when war knocks on our door?" And the answer was uncertain, for the unknown amplified the tension and anxiety exponentially. Tension across the oceans, the waves of the Atlantic seemed calm. But the nautical charts showed a different picture. American officers gathered around tables, lingering on the lines marking sea routes. Merchant ship routes were marked, and areas of increased risk were indicated in red. In recent weeks, some ships had been delayed, some had changed their course, and reports had arrived from others, short, incomplete, and unsettling. Newspapers used careful wording. Tension is rising. Uncertainty at sea, ships of neutral countries may be in danger. But in the rooms in Washington, these sentences were read more harshly. Every movement in the Atlantic, every maneuver in the Pacific, every diplomatic message from Europe was linked to a single question. How much longer could America remain outside? Diplomats reported on meetings with allies. Telegrams were left on tables until late into the night. Some documents were not read aloud, only met with nods, because what was written inside wasn't encouraging. A general jotted down a note on the edge of the map. Then he stopped. He put down his pen. No one asked, but everyone guessed what the word was. War. Secret aid, open accounts. America was officially neutral, but factories were working faster. Ships were being launched one after another in shipyards. Ammunition production was quietly expanding, and trains were carrying cargo overnight. Official statements were cautious. Aid was presented as commercial agreements. Shipments were described as defensive, but military planners spoke differently. For them, this was not just trade. This was a race against time. Scenarios were being written in headquarters. What would be done if a ship was sunk in the Atlantic? Which bases would come to the forefront if a crisis erupted in the Pacific? Which fleets would be mobilized? Which unit would be ready within months? At the end of every plan was the same word, if. If this happens, if that occurs, if it becomes unavoidable. But no one wanted to complete that last sentence. Debates were growing in Congress. Different voices were rising among the public. Some were saying intervention was necessary. Others were reminding us that a new disaster was on the horizon. Newspaper headlines were becoming larger. Is America ready? Is the world reigniting? How long can neutrality last? The questions were multiplying, and the answers were being postponed. Decisions made in the shadows. The lights in the presidential offices stayed on until late. Advisors spoke in hushed tones. Files slid from desk to desk. Maps were folded and unfolded, some points marked with thick lines. The status of airfields, the defense of the Pacific Islands. Each was discussed separately, then reconsidered. One officer said, "It's too early." That silence was the heaviest sentence in the room, because everyone knew history usually didn't wait for those who said, "It's too early." Intelligence reports were increasing. Activity in distant ports, military exercises, new base constructions. These details, seemingly small on paper, formed a single picture when placed side by side. Preparation, a great preparation. But for whom, when, and with what spark? The answers to those questions had not yet been given, but they were approaching. Questions at the door. As 1941 approached, America was no longer just a country observing. The economy was booming, defense budgets were increasing, and new military training programs were being prepared. Patrols were tightened at ports. Patrols had become more regular, and most importantly, the language was beginning to change. It used to be called probability. Now it was called likelihood. In some documents, even that word wasn't used. Only a blank space was left, because everyone knew what to write in that blank space. A consultant stopped as he was leaving the meeting. He reached for the doorknob. Then he turned back. "If this explodes," he said quietly, "are we ready?" No one answered immediately. And that few seconds of silence perhaps was the most honest answer given. Alarm bells. As 1940 progressed, the desks in Washington were more cluttered than ever. Newspapers piled high, telegraph messages were added to files, report folders grew thicker. News from Europe no longer spoke of a single front, maps grew larger. New conflicts were reported in the North Seas. Trade routes in the Atlantic were threatened, and the importance of bases in the Pacific increased daily. American officers worked until dawn. Sometimes the name of a port was mentioned repeatedly. Sometimes a group of islands was underlined in red. In the meeting rooms, chairs creaked, pen tips broke and coffee cups grew cold. And at the end of each meeting, the same silent question hung in the air. Not yet, or is it already too late? Presidential advisors meticulously reviewed the Navy's deployment reports, recalculating fuel stocks, shipyard capacities, and naval patrol areas. Routes in the Atlantic, defense rings in the Pacific. The ranges of the air bases, none of them remained merely on paper anymore. They were all part of an impending possibility, and this possibility grew heavier with each passing week. The expanding front in the shadows. America wasn't officially at war, but the world was already engulfed in it. Some nights, the lights of the White House stayed on until dawn. Diplomatic telegrams arrived from Europe. Warnings were added from the Pacific, and merchant ships' routes were being rearranged. Activity in naval ports had increased. Silent, but constant. Container crates were being moved by cranes, ammunition stocks were being counted, and fuel tanks were being filled. Soldiers were training on ship decks, but this was no longer just routine. Exercises lasted longer. Guard duties became more frequent. Radio communications increased. Officers took small notes in their notebooks, underlining some sentences twice. Possible contact, patrol line to be widened, defense perimeter to be strengthened. Streetcars were running, movie theaters were full, the headlines were getting bigger at the newsstands, but there was no panic in the streets yet. But in the government buildings, there was another world. Closed doors, hush voices, maps, and the only word that was constantly repeated: preparation. The coldness of the decision-making rooms, the debates in the Congress halls dragged on and on. Some argued that staying away was possible. Some said it was a fantasy. Not every speech ended with applause. Some were met with a heavy silence. Numbers were presented. Industrial production, number of aircraft, shipyard capacity, military personnel. Some were taking notes. Some were bowing their heads. Some were looking out the window. Because the issue was no longer theoretical. Every number was the price of a possibility. Every delay gave rise to another scenario. And no one could speak without thinking about how a wrong decision would go down in history books. The files arriving at the presidential desk grew thicker day by day. Some pages contained small maps, some pages contained long report sentences, and some pages contained only a date line underlined in red, not yet announced, but marked, and everyone knew these signs weren't put there to be erased. The moment at the door. As 1941 approached, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Ships in the Atlantic sailed more cautiously, Night lights at bases in the Pacific stayed on longer. Radar stations were being expanded. Patrol flights were increasing. Coded messages were multiplying. America was still not at war, but war was circling around America, shrinking further and further, approaching further and further. The gaps on the maps were closing. The arrows were multiplying, the colors were darkening, and in the decision rooms the question was no longer whispered, but silently considered. When? When would waiting become a risk? When would watching no longer be enough? And this chapter ends here, because the issue was no longer preparation. The issue was now inevitability. And in the next chapter, we will see how that threshold was crossed, but not yet. For now, there are only approaching footsteps. Calculations across the ocean. By the summer of 1940, the Pacific was no longer a blank space on maps. On the desks in Washington, the ocean had ceased to be a blue backdrop. Red lines were drawn across it. Islands were marked with small circles and notes were added. Sea routes, oil shipments, base points, each was weighed separately. The officers were silent, but the pens didn't stop. A circle was drawn at a point. It was erased. It was shifted a little further south. Because the issue wasn't just where they stood. The issue was how far the other side was prepared to advance. Intelligence reports were arriving at the table. Ship movements, new port constructions, airfields, code breakers were trying to piece together fragments of messages. Diplomats were trying to read the gaps between sentences. America was still not officially at war, but war had entered the accounting books. The Navy increased its exercises, convoy systems were re-evaluated, basements on distant islands were strengthened. These preparations were presented to the public as precautions, but the words used in the decision-making rooms were different. We must buy time. They are approaching. They will not retreat. If someone takes the first step, could America really stay on the sidelines? The ocean was no longer a distance. It was a line of tension. Sanctions, pressures, and shattered balances. As we entered 1941, the words began to harden. Notes, warnings, diplomatic messages, and then economic decisions, oil quotas, steel restrictions, frozen accounts. Pens were signing documents on desks, but ships were stationed at sea. Such decisions didn't make as loud a sound as a bullet, but their impact was sometimes deeper. When the other side's raw materials were cut off, the calendar started ticking. Washington knew this. So did the other side. Diplomats smiled in the halls. Calm sentences were given to the newspapers, but in the back rooms the tone changed. The voices lowered. The sentences shortened. Maps were opened again. In one report, the following sentence was underlined. Time is running out. Several times. Underlined, military planners were putting alternatives on the table. If they back down, if we push, if they retaliate, the sentences all led to the same point. At some point, there would be an explosion. The only question was, where, when, and who started it? History would decide. Imminent danger at distant bases. Life began to change at the bases in the Pacific. The number of guards increased. Radar systems were upgraded. Air patrols took off more frequently. The soldiers felt it. The orders were different now. They were more precise, shorter. Less explanation was given. One morning, the ammunition was recounted. In the evening, radio protocols were changed. Lights were turned off earlier at night. Officers scanned the horizon with binoculars. The sea was calm, the sky was clear, but no one was at ease, because a calm ocean could be a harbinger of the worst days. Soldiers were writing letters, but more were putting them in their pockets instead of sending them. Photographs were stuffed inside helmets. Some were talking about return plans, but the sentences never ended because everyone felt the same thing. These preparations were not a drill. The moment at the door. The nights grew longer in Washington. Office lights stayed on until dawn. Telegrams arrived. Codes were being deciphered. Sentences were being written down. Some were read hastily. Some were read over and over again. An officer folded a report. Then he unfolded it. He read it again and silently raised his head. No one asked anything, but everyone understood from his expression. Something was happening. Diplomatic contacts continued. Statements were made, but preparations accelerated. Squads moved. Patrols intensified. Planes were kept waiting on the runway. And the most dangerous moments in history usually begin like this, not loudly in a whisper. This chapter ends here because the next step was now inevitable. And one morning, America would wake up. It would look at the sky, and the world would not be the same world. Maps on the table, the shadow in the ocean. As 1941 progressed, the atmosphere in the rooms in Washington began to change. The issue was no longer just Europe. The Pacific Ocean had for some time taken center stage. Giant maps were unfolded, islands marked with red pens, sea routes divided by lines. The Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, the Japanese mainland, the Chinese coast, the Dutch East Indies. One officer measured with a ruler, another silently took notes. No one raised their voice, because everyone knew if the voice was raised, the truth would also be raised. American intelligence reports were growing thicker. Sea traffic had increased. The activity of the Japanese Navy was attracting attention. The number of ships leaving ports was increasing, and unusual activity was observed at some bases. But were these preparations for an attack, or were they merely threats? That was the question that was truly feared, because misinterpreting could start a war. Ignoring it could lead to an even greater catastrophe. The planners in Washington were caught between two possibilities. On the one hand, the public still wanted to stay out of the war. Pacific news was relegated to tiny corners in the newspapers. People continued with their daily lives in the streets. But behind the scenes, naval exercises were being intensified. Radar systems were being tested, ammunition was being delivered to naval bases, and nobody called it an alarm. For now, economic weapons and diplomatic chess. War didn't always begin with a cannon shot. Sometimes it began with a signature. One of America's most powerful tools wasn't weapons. It was the economy. Oil, steel, machine parts. These resources were vital for Japan. The question was increasingly asked at meetings in Washington. If we turn off the taps, what will happen? Some thought it would be a deterrent, others were more pessimistic, because a country cornered sometimes wouldn't back down. Diplomatic documents circulated on the tables. Embassy reports were read. Messages from Tokyo were deciphered word for word. A hidden meaning was sought in every sentence. Is this a threat? Is this buying time? Is this a real negotiation or a distraction? Diplomats smiled, shook hands, and used formal language. But at the same time, military planners were asking themselves this question at the beginning of the maps. If the talks break down, where will the first blow come from? The Philippines? Southeast Asia? Forward bases in the Pacific? Hawaii? That name was not yet being spoken aloud, but it had begun to appear in some reports. It seemed like a small word, but everyone knew that word could one day fill the headlines. Codes, warnings, and missed tones. Nights grew longer in the intelligence rooms. The sound of typewriters, the crackling of radios, transcribing coded messages onto paper. Cryptologists worked line by line. Some messages were deciphered, some were left incomplete, and some only raised new questions. One officer closed his report and said, "The language is getting harsher." Another added, "But there's no order to attack." That was the problem. There was no clear order. But the tone had changed. The choice of words was different. The emphasis on time had increased. The frequency of meetings had increased. And some Japanese diplomats seemed more hasty than usual. Analysts in Washington were trying to piece these fragments together. But the big picture was still hazy. Some thought it was a bluff. Others, "Something is coming," they said. But what? When? And most importantly, where? At the bases in the Pacific, soldiers continued their daily routines. Guard duty was being carried out, aircraft were being checked, and ships were being maintained. From the outside, it looked like ordinary military life, but tensions were rising at the top, and these kinds of periods were the most dangerous periods in history, because everyone prepares, but no one knows exactly what they are preparing for. America on the brink of fire, densifying shadows in the Pacific. As the summer of 1941 drew to a close, the Pacific no longer seemed like a distant patch of map. Nautical charts spread across desks in Washington began to overshadow documents set aside weeks earlier. Arrows drawn in red and blue pens, circles circling islands, small question marks next to some port names, all meant one thing. Attention was shifting. The area around Hawaii was being marked more frequently. Sea routes to the Philippines were being remeasured, refueling routes calculated, and wind and current reports tucked away in files. Officers stood for long periods in front of these charts, some silently gazing with their arms crossed, others pressing their lips together as they measured distances with rulers. No one wanted to speak hastily, because what was happening in the Pacific was not yet an open conflict, but it was certainly teetering on the brink of peace. The number of reconnaissance flights had increased. Every plane that took to the skies returned with new notes. Increased activity in the ports, anchored ships, unusual maneuvers. Submarine reports were carefully examined. Radio traffic was deciphered. Some messages were clear. Others were extremely vague. And perhaps that was the most disturbing thing. Guard hours at the bases were reorganized. Controls at port entrances were tightened. Radar stations were kept on longer, and personnel changes were reduced in some towers. But the orders were clear. remain calm. No provocation. America was still officially neutral, and this line had to be maintained. But this calm did not match the expressions on people's faces. Officers looked at the horizon longer while watching the sea. Watchmen raised their binoculars more often. Technicians checked the machinery more than necessary because everyone carried an unspoken thought. Something was approaching, and most people had begun to feel that it was no longer a distant possibility. Final accounts in Washington. The nights in the capital hadn't shortened. On the contrary, they had grown heavier. Lights seeping from the windows of some buildings burned until dawn, and even the cleaning staff spoke in hushed tones as they entered. Folders left open on long tables, maps with folded edges, and reports piled high told the story of how the days had passed. Advisors and officers went over the numbers repeatedly. Aircraft production rates, ammunition stockpiles, ship repair times. Each piece of data raised another question. How long could they endure if a front opened? Was it possible to conduct operations in two oceans simultaneously? How strong was the Allies' situation? No one wanted to give definitive answers to these questions, because a wrong estimate could change the course of not just a port or a fleet, but an entire country. The meetings dragged on. Some were held standing in front of maps, others in narrow rooms behind closed doors. The conversations were formal, but the tone had hardened. Sentences were now shorter, and certain words were particularly emphasized. Some documents had notes written in red pen in the corners: urgent, reevaluate, priority. These words were carried from file to file, from desk to desk. News reports in the newspapers were still cautious. The public largely did not want to go to war. Daily life continued in the streets. Cafes were full. Music was playing on the radios. But a completely different time was flowing in the decision rooms. There, not minutes, but probabilities were being measured. And no one dared to ask this question aloud. If the attack comes, where will the first blow land? Alert in the ports. Sunrises at bases on the Pacific coast were not what they used to be. More soldiers patrolled the ports. Ammunition crates were arranged on the piers, and cranes silently lifted and lowered heavy loads. The crews walking on the ship decks walked faster, but their conversations were shorter. Aircraft were kept ready on the runways. Technicians repeatedly opened and closed engine covers, and fuel hoses were checked a second time. Calls for drills had become more frequent. Some crews were called back to deck before they had even gone to bed. Soldiers on duty at radar stations stared at the screens for longer periods. Even the slightest vibration was recorded, and the possibility of false alarms was discussed repeatedly. Officers in the towers scanned the horizon, their faces appearing a little sterner when they lowered their binoculars. At night, the reflections of the port lights on the water seemed brighter. Perhaps everyone was taking every shadow that appeared in the darkness too seriously. But this was not an unfounded anxiety. The sea seemed calm, the sky could be clear, the wind blew gently. But experienced sailors knew this. The greatest storms sometimes began just like this. Silent, movement, deceptive. And everyone knew what they were waiting for, but they couldn't yet name what they were waiting for. On the threshold, as 1941 progressed, the questions in Washington had fundamentally changed. For months, the debate had been whether America would enter the war. Now, the question circulating on the tables was far heavier. When will we be drawn in? Diplomatic negotiations continued. Notes were exchanged between capitals. Texts were weighed word for word, and statements were carefully softened. Newspapers chose their headlines cautiously, and government officials spoke with calm expressions in front of cameras. There was still caution in official discourse. No one wanted to invite panic. No one openly articulated an impending breakdown in front of the public. But military planners were using a completely different timetable. It was secret, it was silent, and it was becoming clearer with each passing day. On the covers of some files, only one word remained: possible. This word was carried from meeting to meeting, underlined, dates added next to it, then erased again. The same word reappeared repeatedly in the corners of reports placed on maps, but everyone in the rooms knew that word might not stay. One morning, it could be replaced by another word. It began. At night, the officers were alone at their desks, looking out the window before closing the files. As the city lights flickered along the Potomac, different scenes swirled in their minds. Darkening horizons, alarm sirens, bustling ports, blacked out runways. Some returned home late, some never. Some took a short nap in their chairs, then got up again and went back to the maps. Because it was no longer just about military preparation. This was a threshold, a thin line standing right in the middle of political decisions, diplomatic balances, military plans, and the delicate lines of public opinion. On one side, the shadow of peace still lingered. On the other, a new fire that could shake the whole world awaited. And everyone in Washington felt they were standing on that line. One step forward, and a chain reaction could begin. One signature, a miscalculation, a single report arriving one morning, and the world could burst into flames again, because the next moment was about to cease being a possibility. The awaited moment was about to overflow from the maps, and the word on some files would soon change. The point of no return. Alarm levels. The autumn months of 1941 were unusually busy in Washington. While the city seemed to calm down with the sunset, the interiors of government buildings were bustling, lights blared, and footsteps echoed in the corridors even into the late hours of the night. Typewriters worked incessantly, telephone lines were constantly ringing, and the files piling up on desks grew larger each morning. Some folders had red seals on the corners. Some were marked with phrases indicating that only a few people were allowed to open them, and some pages bore a single word: urgent. Reports from naval commands were updated almost hourly. Radar coverage areas were recalculated, coastal defenses were reviewed, and additional security rings were drawn around airfields. Fuel depots were checked one by one, ammunition stocks were counted, and ship maintenance schedules were brought forward. Maps were spread out on tables. Officers measured sea routes with rulers, drew small circles around port entrances, and added striking red rings around bases in the Pacific. These rings indicated not only the geography, but also where a potential crisis might erupt. Statements to the press remained cautious. Officials, speaking calmly to microphones, said that the situation is being monitored, emphasized America's commitment to maintaining peace, and implied that the public had no reason to worry. that the language used behind closed doors was far harsher. Phrases like, "time is running out," "the risk is growing," and "the possibility of a surprise cannot be ignored," circulated in the meeting rooms. No one used the word panic, but everyone felt its presence. Some officers remained at their desks after the meetings, looking at the maps again, examining the red-drawn arrows at length, then turning to the window and gazing into the night, because now the issue was no longer simply weighing the possibilities. Shadows gathering in the Pacific. The Pacific was the region where more and more time was spent on maps. The vast blue areas, the seemingly distant chains of small islands, straits, ports, and sea routes were no longer just geographical details, but were read as potential crisis points. Officers traced these points, followed routes, formulated sentences like, "if they leave here," "if they cut this line," "if they head this way," and each time left the end of the sentences with silence. Because everyone filled that blank in their own minds. Intelligence reports were increasing. The movement of the Japanese Navy, increased training exercises, the intensity of refueling, observations on the construction of new bases. While these pieces of information, when viewed individually, seemed like ordinary military activities, when put together, they formed a disturbing picture. Some officers underlined the reports, put question marks in the margins, and added notes such as, "not yet certain," but their facial expressions did not match these cautious sentences. Life at the American bases in the Pacific flowed normally on the surface. Planes were taking off from runways, ships were entering and leaving ports, and soldiers were conducting routine exercises. But commanders were now looking at their units differently. How many pilots were fully prepared? How many ships could set sail within a few hours? How many radar stations were operating without interruption? How many air defense batteries were truly ready? The answers to these questions were written down on desks, then reviewed repeatedly. Some nights, officers spent longer in radio rooms, carefully listening to signals from distant bases, discussing what even a slight delay could mean, because everyone knew that major crises often begin with small signs. Diplomacy examines on the diplomatic front. Talks were ostensibly still ongoing. Notes were being sent, statements carefully drafted, words weighed, and the tone of each sentence repeatedly checked. Trade restrictions, raw material flows, oil shipments, strategic sanctions. In official documents, these were expressed in technical terms, described as measures or balancing steps. But the diplomats preparing these documents knew very well that some decisions would have not only economic, but also military consequences. In the meeting rooms in Washington, chairs were pulled back more forcefully, coffee cups were placed on the table a little faster, and as the conversations dragged on, the tones subtly hardened. Some tried to soften their sentences, while others lingered longer on the maps, because everyone was circling around the same question. If these pressures didn't work, what was next? Some diplomats didn't even put down their notebooks when they returned home in the evening, rethinking the sentences spoken, weighing the meanings between the lines of the words. Was a word too harsh? Was a statement cornering the other side? Was there still room to back down, or were the options narrowing? These questions made it difficult to fall asleep at night, because diplomacy was often like walking a tightrope. If you were too soft, you would appear weak. If you were too hard, you would force the other side to make a move. And by 1941, the feeling that the rope was thinning was spreading. No one in the meeting rooms was openly saying war is inevitable, but everyone realized that each new point discussed reduced the possibility of turning back a little more. The countdown sense. Towards the end of the year, a strange atmosphere began to develop in America. The streets were still crowded, the shops were open, people went about their daily business, but the headlines in the newspapers were increasingly focused on the outside world. Radio broadcasts of European and Pacific news were getting longer. Commentators were unconsciously lowering their voices and choosing their words more carefully. Maps were shown more frequently on broadcasts. Places that seemed distant were suddenly described as being close. In government offices, however, time flowed differently. Calendar pages were being turned, but the tone of meetings was becoming heavier each day. Notes underlined in red pen on documents were multiplying, and expressions like reevaluate, urgent meeting, and priority were becoming commonplace. Some officials thought this was a dangerous habit, because the more commonplace something becomes, the more inevitable it feels. Officers and advisors looked out the windows at night, alone under the city lights, engrossed in their own calculations. How many days do we have? How many weeks? Or was time now measured in days? No one was asking these questions aloud, but they lingered in their glances. And that's where Part 8 got really heavy, because now it wasn't just a matter of possibilities. The question was whether all these preparations would actually have to be used one day. And that day didn't have a date on the calendar yet, but everyone felt the pages turning faster. The inevitable circle. The final diplomatic moves. As the final weeks of 1941 approached, diplomacy had ceased to be a game of patience. The words spoken at the Washington meeting tables were still softly chosen, but the meaning conveyed between the lines had hardened. The notes sent, the meetings held, the protocols prepared. Were they all meant to buy time, or were they the final signs that a solution was truly being sought? No one could say for sure anymore. Diplomats repeatedly wrote and erased their sentences, calculating how every single word would resonate with the other side, because they now knew that a wrongly chosen expression could disrupt weeks of balancing acts in a single day. Some meetings dragged on, and when the parties rose from the table, they carried a weary expression on their faces. Smiles were formal, handshakes were measured, but there was a hardness in their eyes. The effort to read the intentions of the other side was now giving way to the effort to draw boundaries. Some diplomats were jotting down brief notes in their private notebooks, writing things like, "not flexible, likely to back down, maybe buying time." These notes never made it into any official documents, but they circulated within decision-making circles. In Washington, some advisors believed this was a final round. If these talks also proved fruitless, the files on the table would be closed and military plan folders would be opened in their place. And this possibility weighed heavily on the room, because war often doesn't begin with the sound of cannons. Often, it begins when a diplomatic statement no longer receives a response. On the brink of alarm, at the bases, at the same time, a completely different language was being spoken at bases in the Pacific and along the American coast. Here, lists mattered more than words. How many planes could take off? How many ships were ready to leave the port? Were the fuel tanks full? Were the radar systems working without interruption? The answers to these questions were updated daily, and morning reports were reviewed again in the evening. Patrols were intensified at some bases. The number of soldiers on guard on the runways had been increased, and the area covered by searchlights had been expanded. Identity checks at port entrances had become more detailed, and the movements of foreign ships were being noted. Officers stayed at the radio even at midnight, listening to signals from distant outposts and reporting even the slightest delay. Training flights for pilots had been intensified. Air defense units were speeding up their exercises, and ammunition counts were being repeated over and over again. Most of these preparations seemed routine from the outside, but those inside knew it wasn't ordinary. Because when armies started behaving like this, they were usually expecting something. Some soldiers had trouble falling asleep in their barracks at night, getting up early in the morning to go back to the tracks and repeat the same checks. No one explicitly said there might be an attack, but everyone felt that the word hung in the air. The shadow over the public. On the surface, life in American cities flowed normally. Movie theaters were open, games were being played, shop windows were sparkling. But the tone of the news on the radio, the headlines in newspapers, and the columns had slowly changed. The war in Europe was no longer described as a distant issue. Developments in the Pacific were featured more frequently. Maps were printed in the middle of newspapers, and readers were beginning to memorize distant geographies. People paused for a moment while talking in coffee shops, fell silent when the radio volume increased, and listened carefully to the announcer's words. Some thought it was an exaggeration. Others, however, felt deep down that something was approaching, because the sentences read in history books had begun to seep back into everyday language. Mobilization, defense line, alliance, blockade. Families were discussing their children's futures, and some young people were taking the possibility of military service seriously for the first time. Mothers were reading the war news in newspapers for longer periods, and fathers were nodding their heads and silently turning the page. Nobody wanted panic, but a thin shadow had fallen over society, and that shadow grew a little darker with each passing day. The final files are opened. In the secret rooms in Washington, some folders were now being left open on the tables. They had titles written in large letters: defense scenarios, counterattack plans, evacuation routes, civil defense arrangements. These files had been prepared for months, but now, for the first time, they were being taken so seriously. Maps emerged from between thick covers and were spread out on the tables. Routes drawn with colored pencils were being remeasured, and small notes were tucked into the corners. Some plans had been reviewed repeatedly, while others were being discussed so openly for the first time. Everyone in those rooms knew that these documents were not just paper. Every line touched the fate of thousands of soldiers, the security of cities, and the future of a nation. Advisors turned the pages, underlined sections, and put question marks next to plans that were deemed too early. Some were recalculating the numbers, some were silently examining the estimates of losses, and others were tracing the maps, whispering the names of ports, straits, and distant bases over and over again, because everyone was thinking the same thing. If these folders were completely opened, the way back could be closed. War plans, once they sat at the center of official desks, were usually not quietly removed. When they were opened, time sped up. Decisions were made faster. Hesitations cost more. Some meetings were short. They ended with tense, abrupt sentences. The files were closed again, and no one made eye contact as they left the room. Others lasted for hours. The coffee grew cold, the ashtrays filled, the city lights behind the windows changed, and those inside still stood before the same paintings. But in the end, the same heavy silence remained in the room. No one looked relieved as they left the table, because everyone felt that history was now accelerating. Not days, not weeks, but perhaps only days, they sensed that much bigger decisions could be made. Because the issue was no longer whether preparations were being made or not. The issue was now at what point the preparations would turn into a chain of command. Which file would cease to be a draft and become an implementation document? Which sentence would cease to be a possibility and become an instruction? Because now the question was, will America go to war? No. The question was now becoming, when? And perhaps more frightening was this: could that date have already begun to be written somewhere? The hours are running out. In the corridors of Washington, steps were now taken more quickly. Doors closed more frequently. Telephone lines remained busy longer, and secretaries moved silently but hurriedly between desks. Correspondence that would normally take weeks was now completed in days. Reports were updated every few hours, with new notes added in red pen to the top corners. VW, priority, immediately. These words were appearing more and more frequently. Efforts were made to avoid creating an atmosphere of panic in the capital. Official statements were calm, balanced, and measured. Officials who appeared before the cameras carefully chose their words, never lacked smiles, and simply said, "We are closely monitoring the situation." But at the same time, a completely different language was being spoken in windowless meeting rooms. There, the words were sharper, the timelines harsher. Maps were opened, circles were drawn around the islands in the Pacific, and sea routes were marked with red lines. An officer stood measuring a long route with a ruler, his head fixed on a single question: how many hours will it take us to close this? The answers weren't quick, because behind those questions lay irreversible possibilities. Activity in military depots had increased. Crates were being opened, inventories updated, some types of ammunition separated from others. Uniforms were being checked, and deployment plans for new units were being reorganized. Maintenance times for ships in ports were being shortened, and exercises were being intensified under the heading of routine. No one was openly saying, "We are preparing," but everyone felt that the word preparation was now moving from the back pages of files to the front covers. Diplomatic channels were still open, notes were being sent, meetings were being held, and receptions were being organized at embassies. Behind the smiling faces were measured tones. Hidden meanings were placed under every sentence, every word weighed, because sometimes a single expression could erase weeks of negotiations. Some diplomats in Washington asked themselves the same question before closing their notebooks at night. Is there still time? And then came the more difficult question. Or are the hours running out? The newspapers, meanwhile, were caught between two different worlds. Front pages emphasized neutrality. while back pages featured enlarged maps, military budgets, and naval power graphs. Even if readers didn't notice, the tone of the pages was changing. Headlines were becoming harsher, words heavier, tension, warning, preparation. These were no longer rare expressions. Nights were getting shorter in the headquarters. Cold coffees, half-read reports, and crumpled maps piled up on the tables. Officers hung their jackets on the backs of chairs, loosened their ties, but didn't get up from their desks. Some looked out the window at the dark city, watching people returning home in the lights. Life went on in those streets. Cinemas were open, restaurants were full, but those inside those rooms knew that an invisible shadow was growing over that daily life. Because the issue was no longer about opening the documents, the issue was that some orders were beginning to move beyond being drafts. That for the first time, the time was being written next to some dates. That some plans were being marked with a pencil, not an eraser. And the same thought echoed in everyone's mind in Washington. If these wheels started turning at full speed once, no one would be able to stop them easily. And perhaps the most frightening thing was this: the moment of decision was much closer than they thought. As the final months of 1941 approached, the atmosphere in Washington had changed noticeably. Meetings were no longer filled with discussions of mere probabilities or cautious interpretations of vague scenarios. The language of reports had hardened, sentences shortened, and notes on documents filled with sharper expressions. The corners of some files were curled from repeated opening and closing. Arrows on maps that had been there for weeks were darkened instead of being erased, and sea routes across the Pacific were marked with thicker lines. New defensive rings were being added around bases, port capacities recalculated, and naval commanders meticulously reviewed aircraft ranges and fuel tank occupancy rates. Every calculation now carried not only probabilities but also the weight of an impending conflict. While diplomatic contacts continued on paper, the tone had changed significantly. Meetings were stripped of long, polite phrases, replaced by short, cold, and measured expressions. Telegrams from embassies arrived late at night, were read under desk lamps until dawn, and each line was weighed repeatedly. All these messages ultimately led to a single question. Was this merely a new phase of diplomatic pressure, or were they hinting at a much harsher move? The president's advisors listed different scenarios one after another, marking some possibilities with a red pen as high risk for the first time, and options previously discussed cautiously were now being openly debated. And then, one morning, a report from the Pacific stood out from the others. It was short but heavy. It contained sharp and unambiguous statements. It spoke of unusual air movements, overflows of aircraft, unexpected changes in maritime traffic, radio silences. This document was read repeatedly at headquarters, but at first no one commented aloud, because some reports don't lighten with each reading. On the contrary, they become heavier with each repetition. Even the spaces between sentences seem like threats. What is left unsaid says more than what is written. At naval bases, patrols were intensified, hours spent in front of radar screens lengthened, and air patrol routes were quietly redrawn. But the public statements were extremely calm. The only message given to the press was routine measures. The official language was cool, But everyone working behind the defense plans knew this was no ordinary time. Meanwhile, daily life continued in many American cities. People shopped, went to movie theaters, read newspapers while sipping coffee, and did not yet perceive the tension in the headlines as a personal threat. The headlines contained news from distant fronts, spoke of diplomatic crises, but war still seemed like a foggy and distant possibility across the ocean. Yet in the capital, for the first time, definite dates were being written next to some clocks. Some meetings continued into the late hours of the night, and some fell asleep at their desks before returning home. And it was at this point that the story accelerated, because now events were beginning to overshadow months of planning. Reports from bases in the Pacific arrived in rapid succession, some delayed, some incomplete, and some cut off far more abruptly than they should have. Communications officers scanned the frequencies repeatedly, trying to piece together the missing parts of the interrupted messages, while officers standing by the maps fixed their gaze on the same few points. The names of some islands were now mentioned more frequently, some ports, some sea passages, some routes. And in the rooms in Washington, no one was asking the question anymore, are we going to war? The question circulating in everyone's mind had become, has it begun? That make themselves felt long before official announcements. Some wars begin to hover like a heavy shadow in the atmosphere before they are declared, because the issue was no longer whether or not to make a decision. The issue was to catch what was happening in time. And America found itself in the countdown, the moment history closed. The countdown was over. The calculations made in the rooms of Washington for months, the arrows repeatedly drawn on the maps, the notes jotted down in red pen, and the reports read until dawn under the desk lamps that never went out, the increasingly harsh tone of diplomatic sentences, and the warnings from the Pacific merging with the blazing fronts in Europe, all flowed towards a single point. Each scenario considered a possibility slowly giving way to a reality that was beginning to take shape. America had long been an observer. It had silently measured, patiently calculated, weighed every possible outcome. And, as a society that had not forgotten the still fresh wounds of the First World War, it had tried to withdraw itself to avoid being dragged into a new catastrophe, because years of debates in the halls of Congress, cautious headlines in the newspapers, and the public's reading of the conflicts on distant fronts as if they were news from another world had built a deep wall of hesitation in the nation's mind. But the world had shrunk. The oceans no longer seemed as protective as they once were. Storms originating on distant continents approached the shores slowly but surely, carried by the wind. And in the decision-making rooms of Washington, fewer and fewer people could say, "It won't affect us." And finally, the awaited moment had arrived. Diplomatic channels had narrowed. Notes were written in shorter and colder terms. Military preparations had become undeniable, from the activity in ports to the intensity at air bases. Pilots reviewed their flight schedules repeatedly, while radar screens were monitored day and night. Every sentence uttered in the presidential office carried a heavier responsibility than the last, and some words were weighed twice before being spoken aloud. And now, as we stop and look back at the end of this long journey, we see not only the movement of armies or the decisions made by states, but also how the moments that silently changed the lives of young men going to the front, ships waiting in ports, Documents signed at tables, telegrams read at midnight, and families waiting for news by their radios at home slowly took shape. The fragile legacy of the First World War, the rocky road leading to the Second World War, and a world squeezed between two great catastrophes reminded us that history often progresses not with a single explosion, but with accumulated decisions, postponed confrontations, and whispers not heard in time. Perhaps the most striking thing was this. No one could fit how such a great destruction began into a single day, because great wars often grow with unanswered questions, ignored signs, and decisions postponed with the excuse that it's too early. Throughout this video, we watched how history slowly but surely accelerated, how a nation prepared itself by waiting, how a world was redivided, and ultimately, how the point of no return was crossed. But as we stand here today, we must consider this story not merely as an event of the past, but as part of humanity's collective memory. Because history not only recounts what happened, but also reminds, warns, and raises unsettling questions about the future.